Mr. Chairman,
Articles of Confederation now resolve this convention. The national government ought to be established.
Consent to this Constitution.
Welcome back for Lesson 7. Article 1. The states delegate 20 powers to Congress. In 1776, the states had refused to delegate enough authority to Congress to enable it to perform its legitimate functions. As a result, they almost lost the Revolutionary War. In this lesson, we shall discover which powers the people were willing to delegate to the federal government. Once the founders established that we have a Congress and how they're going to be elected and things. Now you'll notice as we go through this Constitution, we're not going to deal with like just the mechanics of things. You know, that you have to be 35 years old to be the president and that you have to be a natural born citizen. Well, maybe we should go through that one. No, we're not going to go through those kind of details. Those are things that you can kind of do on your own. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to focus in on the areas of the Constitution that have been abused and kind of tie them into the principles and the history that we learned in the previous lessons. And so we're not going to deal with, exactly how the election process works and things like that. But we are talking here now, of course, we just got through discussing those 4 ways that all these laws are coming out of Washington. Now we'll talk a little bit about the powers that Congress have. So the founders realized that they needed to put some boundaries around Congress. So they gave Congress only 20 powers. That's it, 20. You'll see right there in your margin. There are about 20 powers delegated to Congress. Not 20,000, but 20, okay? And in this, it states right here in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. And what's the first reason why they lay and collect taxes? To pay the debts. To pay the debts is the first reason why they should be doing this. And provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. So here we have this clause, general welfare. General welfare is your first blank there on page 35. Now originally when the founders put general welfare in the document, it was originally intended to be a limitation on the taxing and spending authority of Congress. Okay. Because see, the word general meant just that, general. So general welfare, not private welfare. Private welfare is when we take a car from Mr. Smith and give it to Mr. Jones. Right? That's private welfare. General welfare is for everybody. Okay? So basically, this is the easiest way to remember what this phrase really means. It means all of the laws need to be for all of the people all of the time. Okay? Now, we, of course, don't see this coming out of Washington now. In fact, we see it. One of the worst things is when the lawmakers actually exempt themselves from the law. Right? Things like Social Security and other things, lawmakers have actually exempted themselves from some of those programs. And so here it is, they write these laws for us, what they think is best for us, but they have a whole different program for themselves. And so all of the laws for all of the people all of the time is what the general welfare means. But when Alexander Hamilton became the Secretary of the Treasury, he decided that general welfare should mean that it was a general grant of power. Grant of power is your next blank for letter A, which would allow Congress to tax and spend for any good cause. Now, are there any good causes here? See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Every one of us are a good cause, right? I'm worth at least 5 or 6 good causes. So we have all these good causes. This is not what the founders meant. If the founders meant that this was a general grant of power, then why even put the 20 limitations, right? This is a limited government, not an unlimited government. So we don't, these phrases don't mean that government can do anything they want. And so this totally torpedoed the whole idea of limited government. Limited is your next blank for letter A. Limited. Now Hamilton was immediately opposed by Jefferson and Madison. Your next 2 blanks, Jefferson and Madison. And he said, they said, Alex, you know this isn't true. And they were right. Alexander Hamilton, who wrote most of the Federalist Papers, he actually wrote right in those Federalist Papers the correct definition of general welfare. He even talked about how we don't have to worry about an overreaching government because of things like general welfare that keeps it restricted to all of the laws for all the people. But yet, when he got into power, he had changed his mind. You see, this is what power does. In fact, this is what shows you how how incredible the founders were when they sat in Philadelphia and wrote the Constitution. They knew that they were going to be the heads of state when they were writing this document, because they already were the heads of state. They already were. Many of them already sat in Congress, and all these people had already been governors and things like that. And so they figured, but all these restrictions and limitations they put on themselves, because they knew that they were not immune from the dangers of being having so much power. So Alexander Hamilton is a good example of that. So Jefferson and Madison, they got opposed to it, and the Supreme Court agreed with Jefferson and Madison. And they agreed for over 100 years, until 1936, your next blank on the top of page 36. In the opinion on the Butler case, Justice Roberts and others joined the Supreme Court in saying that Congress could pass any law for any good cause. They could tax and spend for any good cause. They right there in this ruling, they actually said, we are now going to abandon the Jefferson-Madison interpretation and go to the Hamiltonian interpretation. They recognize that we've had this interpretation for over 100 years, but we are going to turn 180 degrees and now start with this new interpretation. So a terrible thing happened in 1936. In fact, as it states in letter D, federal budgets rose from a little over $6 billion in 1936 to more than $3.5 trillion in 2010. Now, this is just the budget that they tell us on paper. Of course, as you know, there's a lot of things that they don't put in the budget. Some foreign aid they don't put in the budget, and some emergency spending, some military spending they pull out. We don't really know the actual size of the budget. In fact, we haven't even had an official budget for quite some time now. But still, even using those numbers that they give us, $3.5 trillion, that's a pretty significant increase from that $6 billion. Now, the next item here that I want to talk about is interstate commerce. Now, there's always three clauses that the government or Congress will state that's giving them the authority if they can't specifically identify the authority. You know, forever with this health care bill, people kept asking, where in the Constitution do you have the authority? And at first they chuckled and said, no, we're going to just take serious questions. That's not serious. That's very, very serious. But nevertheless, they finally told us, well, it's Commerce Clause. So they always tell us one of three things: general welfare, commerce, or another clause that's not in the book here is what we call the elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause. In fact, let's go to that on page 7 of your Constitution. We'll talk briefly about that since it's not in the book. It's the second to the last paragraph on page 7. So this is after all those 20 powers are listed, okay? And it says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So people think that that means that they can make all laws that they think is necessary and proper. End of story, open-ended, right? Okay? But it doesn't. It has a condition here: for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So they can only pass laws that are necessary and proper for helping them fulfill those 20 responsibilities, or the foregoing powers, the powers that are previously listed. And so it doesn't give them this big open-ended thing. So for example, post roads. It says that Congress has the authority to establish post roads, but it doesn't specifically give them the authority to enter into contracts with contractors to build those roads. And so that would be an authority that's necessary and proper to fulfill building the post roads. So that's implied that they can obviously enter into a contract with a contractor to fulfill that foregoing power. So that's necessary and proper. It does not mean that it's open-ended. Again, why in the world would they list limited powers and then say, but you can do whatever you want after that? See, that just goes against this idea of limited powers. So the other one is interstate commerce. They always mention interstate commerce because they say they have the authority to regulate commerce between the states, which they do. But the way that the Constitution says is to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Now, what does the word regulate mean? Control, that's how we define it today, sure, because that's what it means to us. Conform, yeah, we got it. To make regular or to make consistent, that's right. It's to make regular. So it's to make it so that it's the same throughout the country. So you remember the states were treating each other like foreign countries. They had to pay for, go through customs and pay tariffs and things going from one state to the next. Well, this whole thing was all about, interstate commerce was all about a free flow of commerce. Commerce is your, or flow, is your blank for letter A. A free flow of commerce. So for example, Arizona restricted the number of train cars that you were able to have on a train going through our state. And it was a lower number than California and New Mexico and most of the other states. And so what was happening is you'd have to bring a train and you'd have to take cars off and go through Arizona and then go back and pick up the leftover cars and come. And so Congress and the Supreme Court finally said, no, Arizona, you can't do this. This is interrupting the free flow of commerce. And so Arizona had to change that law. Now, so that's a correct application of interstate commerce. It was just there mostly for transportation, free flow. Transportation is your next blank for letter B. But letter C, under pressure of war and depression, the Supreme Court twisted or reversed the traditional cases on interstate commerce. And they then said that Congress could regulate interstate commerce for commerce that affects the states directly or indirectly. Indirectly is your next blank. Indirectly. Now, what doesn't affect interstate commerce indirectly? It all does. Now, my concrete company has trucks that we drive our equipment and stuff around with, and I have to have a federal transportation ID on those trucks, even though I never leave the state of Arizona. And the reason why is because I might be carrying goods that were manufactured in another state. And so Congress says we can regulate that. That is not what the founders are talking about here. It's just simply the free flow transportation here. But as a result, this usurpation of power has had sweeping federal regulations over, number one, intra-state transportation of goods. Intra-state. Labor disputes. Disputes is your next blank, number two. Number three, price controls over anything that affects commerce, which is virtually everything, right? And federal controls on industry involved directly or indirectly in a nationwide current of commerce. Now I have here a pictogram from the U.S. News and World Report, February 11th, 1980. You'll notice the headline there, Your Hamburger, 41,000 regulations. Wow. That was 30 years ago. 41,000. Now, I'll get some examples here on this diagram of what some of these regulations are. For example, the thickness of pickles is federally regulated. Slices must be between 1/8 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch thick. Okay? Mayonnaise. Mayonnaise may be seasoned or flavored as long as the substances do not color it to look like egg yolk. Heaven forbid your mayonnaise is too yellow. What if you like yellow mayonnaise? You can't have it. It's against the federal government. Against the law there. Oh, this is a great one. Ketchup. To be considered grade A fancy, it must flow no more than 9 centimeters in 30 seconds at 69 degrees Fahrenheit. The thickness of ketchup is federally regulated to be grade A fancy. Now you wonder, how in the world does this stuff get passed? Well, first of all, we know that they're not reading the bills very much anymore, so that's one way. The other way is, can you imagine, remember when we talked about monopolies? You can just imagine a ketchup company that's got a buddy in Congress, and they decide, we want this federal label of grade A fancy for ketchup, and we want to put these restrictions around it in order to be considered grade A fancy, and they make it fit their ketchup and not their competitors' extra thick or extra runny ketchup, right? And so you see how that restricts entry into the market. You see how it makes it so they get this government-approved label. So that's exactly how this kind of thing gets passed, okay? One of my favorites here, lettuce. The crispness of lettuce is federally regulated. Now, I don't even know how you measure the crispness of lettuce, but I do know that burger that I had at the burger joint the other day, it was definitely failing in this federal law, right? Definitely violating that federal law. Anyway, have fun eating your hamburger the next time you eat a hamburger. So interstate commerce. Okay, let's go now into Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. To coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. So before we kind of go into this section, first of all, let's hit these first two blanks. The power to coin money is basically, the Constitution says that the states and all this needs to exist on a gold and silver standard. Gold and silver, your blanks there. And you'll see that even the states are forbidden to pay any debts with anything other than gold and silver. Right? And that's still in the Constitution. We have not amended that, folks. States are still required to pay their debts in gold and silver. Is that happening? No, probably not. So we'll hit a couple more of these real quick, and then we're going to go into the history of money. So eventually the courts decided that we can go ahead and start issuing paper money as long as it's always backed by gold and silver. See, the founders didn't even really agree. Gold and silver is your next blank for letter A. They didn't even really agree with any paper money that was even backed by gold and silver because they knew what happened. You see, the founders, when they sat down at the Constitutional Convention, do you know what the continental dollar was worth?
Hardly anything else.
Zero. They had a total economic collapse when it came to their federal currency. It was worth zero. And so they knew the dangers of paper money. They also knew they had some experience with the dangers of paper money that was even backed by something, gold and silver or whatever, because in their states they'd been experimenting with this in some cases for about 100 years. Massachusetts had been experimenting with it for quite some time. And so eventually the courts finally said, okay, it's kind of cumbersome to carry all this gold and silver around, so you can start issuing paper money as long as it's always backed by gold and silver. And so that kind of made things a little bit more convenient. Now let's get into a little bit about the history of money. So money is all different types of money throughout the world, and exchanging things like seashells and precious metals and all different kinds of stuff. But to kind of get into the history of our monetary system, we begin with the goldsmiths of Europe a few hundred years ago. And these goldsmiths in Europe, as you can imagine, as they were making things out of gold and silver and whatnot, they would have to have these great safes in order to keep all their gold and silver. And so they built these beautiful safes, and they kept all that gold and silver just protected. And so then their neighbors saw how protected their gold and silver was and started asking them, can we keep some of our gold and silver in these safes? And so those goldsmiths said, well, sure, we can do that. And of course, they'd charge a little fee, and they would deposit the money into their safe, and they would give them a little written certificate saying that they had deposited this specific amount of money. Well, before long, these goldsmiths noticed that these certificates were being handed out back and forth and were being used as currency. And so these goldsmiths, that's it, it's pretty cool. That works. And so the goldsmiths started noticing that not very many people were coming back to retrieve their gold very often. And so they discovered that they didn't have to keep all that gold. They could actually start giving out these certificates of deposit. They could start loaning certificates of deposit without actually having the gold there. And then what would happen is they would end up having just a small fraction of gold compared to the amount of certificates that they had out there. And that was the birth of fractional banking. Okay, fractional banking, where you have just a small fraction of the money that you actually have going out. So they're making money out of what? Out of nowhere, right? Out of nothing. And then all of a sudden the people, they start kind of getting a little curious. They're looking around and thinking, boy, there's an awful lot of certificates of deposits floating around here being exchanged. Is there really this much gold in that safe? And so they start getting a little nervous. So they start turning in their certificates and getting their gold. Before you know it, more people get nervous. And what's this? It's a run on the bank, right? And the goldsmith's getting a little nervous because he doesn't have enough gold in there. So before long, the goldsmiths, at this point, they had become the banks of Europe. And they started realizing that if they took a little percentage of that gold and set it aside, that kind of gave them a reserve. So that gave them enough money to hopefully give it out, but they were still fractional, so they still didn't have quite enough. So what they ended up doing is all the banks got together and said, if we take a small percentage of all of our money and put it in one pool, then we'll have a bigger reserve. So if one bank has a run on the bank, we'll take that reserve, give all the gold out. As soon as it all calms down and the people are all confident, oh, I guess the gold was there, they bring all that gold back and redistribute it back out to those banks. So you see, they end up kind of pulling the wool over our eyes. We think that the money's there, but it's not. And so this was the birth of not just fractional banking, but now fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking. What ended up happening, we'll go back a little bit more to 1694, when William III was at war with France. And he needed a lot of money. And by this time, these goldsmiths were full-fledged bankers. And the government didn't necessarily like what they were doing with this fractional banking. See, if you and I were to do this kind of thing in our private businesses, that would be considered fraud, illegal. You know, we could be fined or even incarcerated for such a thing. And so at this time, when William III was needing to fight these wars, he needed money, so he went to some of these rich bankers and said, you know, can I borrow some money? And they said, absolutely, we'll let you borrow some money, but you need to give us the authority to do what we're doing. So they actually made it government authority to do this. Then what they said, a couple of these banks said, what we also want you to do is make it so that the currency that we print, we'll go ahead and print a bunch of currency and give it to you as your loan, but the currency that we print, we want that to be the official government currency. And we want it to basically be illegal for all these other goldsmiths that are doing this kind of thing to where they can't do it anymore. So you can't exchange those certificates of deposit. You can only exchange this currency. And so basically they got government in bed with this fractional reserve banking system. And so that caused some pretty major problems. And there's two temptations. When you put private banks in charge of our monetary system, there are two temptations that the banks have that are contrary to the good of the people. And that is, number one, they have a temptation to encourage war, because wars are very profitable for banks. In fact, we've seen throughout the history of the world where many banks have supported and lent money to both sides. In fact, a lot of times when they loan money to one side, they will say that not only will we loan you money, but the conditions of repayment is that if you're the victor, you have to pay the debt that the loser borrowed from us. Isn't that amazing? So then they play both sides. And they're able to get repaid by both sides, whether winner or loser. The winner has to pay for the debt for both sides. And so that's one of the first things. The other thing that is a temptation is to cause boom and bust cycles. Because you see what happens in boom and bust cycles is you have the people that acquire a great amount of wealth through property, and they borrow money from the banks, and it's all fractional money, right? They're just only getting a small percentage. The banks only have a small percentage of assets compared to the amount of money that they're giving you. So they're really giving you money that they're making out of thin air when you're borrowing your home. But then, if you have a bust cycle, what happens to your home? It drops in value, but you still owe a lot of money on it. So what happens to you? You go bankrupt. You foreclose. And what happens to your home? The bank takes it. Now that home, even though it's been devalued, it still has a lot higher value than that fake money that the banks actually loaned you. So now the banks have real assets for something that they created money just out of nothing. You see? So they create these boom and bust cycles because they increase the wealth of the people and then take the wealth of the people. Increase the wealth of the people, take the wealth of the people. And that's exactly why they like these boom and bust cycles. That should make you pretty mad, right? Okay? Now, what ended up happening is in the early 1700s, Massachusetts created some sound money. They created money based on gold and silver, and it worked very, very well for their state. And until, guess what ended up happening? The banks of Europe decided that they needed to convince King George that this was not a good system, and so they outlawed Massachusetts system that they had. And it made it so Massachusetts went into a great recession or even a depression because the banks basically did away with their gold standard or their sound money system. And then in 1749 is when the Parliament actually made it official that the currency of the United States or of the colonies or their debts had to be paid back with gold and silver. So all this sound money that the states had or put together was basically worthless, and because gold and silver was quite scarce in America, it made it so that all of America ended up going into a recession. This kind of is the very beginning of what started along the line that created the Revolutionary War. So then what ended up happening is, well, first of all, let me give you a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He said, "If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied. The issuing power of money should be taken from the banks and restored to Congress and the people to whom it belongs." Now this is an interesting point because the founders discovered a lot of things. They discovered what level of government to place certain things on, and they also discovered how much the government should be in charge of that thing. Like religion, off limits. Federal government shouldn't do anything related to religion. But when it comes to currency, the people's currency, 100% government control. Because the moment you put that into private hands, then it always ends up failing, the private banks. And so that's what Jefferson's saying there. Because you've got to keep that money with the people, and that's what keeps it much more free. But Hamilton, again, is the one that decided to start the Bank of the United States. And so he brought this European idea of fractional reserve banking into America and established the Bank of the United States. But they gave it a 20-year period, and it was to expire after that 20 years. Now Hamilton, after just a handful of years, ended up regretting doing that. He recognized that it was an absolute mistake because it put the power of our currency in the hands of just a few people. So definitely not a good thing. And so then we let the Bank of the United States expire, which some people believe that was one of the major things that led to the War of 1812, because guess when it expired? It expired at the very end of 1811, and so 1812. So there's a little evidence of that, but that's the great forgotten war, right? 1812. And then Lincoln, when it got time for the Civil War, we were back into control of the second Bank of the United States, and so we're back in the same situation. And when Lincoln went to these banks, or to this second Bank of the United States, he was asking for money to borrow to fight the war, and they were definitely willing to give him the money, but they wanted 28% interest. And Lincoln was appalled. And so what Lincoln did is he went to Congress, and he got Congress to agree to let him borrow money on the future taxes of the people. And so he created the greenback. And the greenback was a federal treasury note, or a promissory note. Okay? And so that's how Lincoln bypassed the banks in order to create money that was actually owned by the people. Now, we were borrowing from ourselves, so it still wasn't that great of a system, but it was at least our money. Now, the banks they were furious about this, and so they did everything they could to undermine and devalue the greenback. And they were eventually successful enough that they were able to buy the greenbacks at a devalued rate using debt money, again, at these high interest rates and things. And so the banks were able to achieve that. So then along comes the Industrial Revolution, and you have these big power brokers, J.P. Morgan and Carnegie and these guys, Rockefeller. And J.P. Morgan decided that he was going to be quite ruthless with his competition. And so he went around and started spreading the rumor that the Heinz family, their banks, were about ready to go under. And he got a couple of his pals to keep spreading that rumor, and before you know it, they had a run on those banks. And which the run on those banks made people nervous about the other banks. So there ended up being runs on these other banks. And so you had this big economic problem. This is in the early 1900s, 1907, right in that area. And so what happened? J.P. Morgan came along and made a deal with Congress and said that if, I will write $200 million worth of these promissory notes that we'll throw out into the market, and that will help increase the economy. Well, where did he get the backing for the $200 million? Congress. Didn't exist. It made it out of nothing. And so he put it out there and was able to get a tremendous amount of assets as a result of this $200 million. And so he discovered this is a good thing. This is a great thing. So they get together with a couple of individuals, J.P. Morgan and others. Many of you are probably familiar with the meeting at Jekyll Island, Jekyll's Island, right? In which they got together and they formulated this plan. And one of their plans was to elect a president. And the president that they selected was Woodrow Wilson. And they knew that Woodrow Wilson was going to have a tough time winning. And so they got Theodore Roosevelt, because Taft was the incumbent. And so they got Theodore Roosevelt to run as an independent, knowing that that would split the Republican vote and Woodrow Wilson would take power. And so Woodrow Wilson did take power. And then what happened at Jekyll's Island was they had basically drafted the legislation for the Federal Reserve. And so they put it in the hands of some key people in Congress. Woodrow Wilson is in support of it. And then guess what the bankers did? The very people who wrote it, they came out strongly against it. So then the politicians were able to say, see, Wall Street doesn't want this. They want to continue to take your wealth. And so they said, we've got to hold off Wall Street. We've got to, push these power barons down. And so the people got all on board and said, oh yeah, take the rich down. But it was those very people that actually wrote the legislation for the Federal Reserve. So then guess what happened? Of course, the Federal Reserve ends up passing on December 22nd in 1913, right before Christmas, their Christmas recess, when the whole economy is supposedly on a collapse. We're going into these major boom and bust cycles. We're going to enter into a major depression, right? Does that sound familiar? Right? It's just a different way of saying the fiscal cliff, right? And what's happening? Where are we now? We're right now we're December, and we've got the fiscal cliff happening. They're getting ready to go on Christmas recess. Exact same scenario. Oh, and the laws that they have are to fight off those evil Wall Street folks. It's the exact same thing. Folks, they've been playing us for 100 years, the exact same way over and over and over again. And it's all about getting control of that money. See, the Federal Reserve put the control of our currency right into the hands of private banks. And in it, it says that we can charge the Federal Reserve for the right to issue our currency. But guess what the law also says? The Federal Reserve Board gets to determine what that percentage is. Guess what the percentage has been for 100 years? Zero. 0%. So instead, they're able to set the rates that we pay for them to print our money. And so now we pay for the right for our money to even exist. So every dollar we print, we already owe money, because it costs us money in order to print those dollars. It makes you mad, doesn't it? So, it's definitely a mess. Now, I got a couple of quotes I want to read to you. Just 3 years after the Federal Reserve System went into operation, Woodrow Wilson decided that this was a bad thing. And here's what he said. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated in the Federal Reserve System. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. This is Woodrow Wilson, the one that made this possible, or one of the people that made it possible. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. Woodrow Wilson recognized what he had done. See, when he was at Princeton University, he actually was writing papers about how great J.P. Morgan was for rescuing the economy because he threw this $200 million into it and all this stuff. And so he was praising Woodrow Wilson. And praising J.P. Morgan. And so that's why they selected him as the guy they wanted to put up for president. But now Woodrow Wilson regrets it. Now the Federal Reserve Act was sponsored by a couple of senators. And one of those senators, originally the Federal Reserve Act required that the Federal Reserve maintain stable money, had to be backed by gold and silver. And this is what that senator said. This is much later after the bill was passed. This is one of the bill's sponsors. This mandatory provision was stricken out in the House under the leadership of the Carter class. I was unable to keep this mandatory provision in the bill because of the secret hostilities developed against it, the origin of which at the time I did not fully understand. So there's hostilities against keeping it stable money even in the hands of the Federal Reserve. But he didn't know who it was, but then he discovered. He said, under the administrations of Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, this act was diverted from its proper purpose on the advice of some who controlled the policies of a number of the largest banks. So it was the banks that wanted that money to be unstable. So then another one of the supporters of the bill, he was the Democratic Party whip at the time, and he was one of the ones that helped it be pushed through. He ended up saying, in my long political career, the one thing I genuinely regret is my part in getting the banking and currency legislation enacted into law. So all these people that were involved in this, unknowingly, I believe, they recognized after a while what happened. Because what happened shortly after the Federal Reserve was put in place in 1913?
World War I, income tax,
That's right. World wars, boom and bust cycles. See, that was one of the things they used to sell the Federal Reserve to us. We're not going to have any more boom and bust cycles. We had the biggest boom and bust cycles that the countries had ever seen. The Great Depression came shortly after that, right? The recession in the 1920s. You just had these immediate boom and busts. You had a couple of major world wars. And there's a number of individuals that talk about even those world wars. We're not going to go into that. But I'm going to read. Oh, this is an interesting one. Quite some time ago, the Federal Reserve Board chairman was asked a question by, when he was being interviewed. The interviewer said, how did you get the money to buy these $2 billion of government bonds? And the chairman said, we created it. And the interviewer said, out of what? And he said, out of the right to create credit money. So basically, we created it because we have laws that say we can create it. But they don't create it out of anything. There's nothing backing it. There's no just creating it out of nowhere. Charles Lindbergh, the father of the famous Atlantic flyer, said this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The worst legislative crime of all ages is perpetuated by this banking and currency bill. The caucus and the party bosses have again operated and prevented the people from getting the benefits of their own government. Right? So, I think that's enough discouragement for now. So anyway, that gives you a little history of where money started, at least our type of money, with the Goldsmiths and things, fractional reserve banking, how it got its start, and then where we are with fractional reserve banking today. The Federal Reserve is not federal, nor is it reserved. But it is not a federal arm of the federal government. It is owned by private banks. And the founders said that we would wake up as slaves in our own country if we let this happen. And that's exactly what has happened. We are absolutely beholden to basically what the Federal Reserve does when it comes to our economy. Okay, so let's jump back into the book. Letter B, to regulate the value thereof originally meant literally the value. A $5 bill, a $1 bill, 25-cent coin. It was literally the value that was being stamped on those coins. It did not mean that they got to determine what our money was worth. The free market does that. Okay? So letter B, the Federal Reserve. Reserve is your blank there, because that's when all this started changing. In 1913, we were taken off the gold standard, and we were issued, or 1933, sorry, and we were issued silver certificates. Letter C, silver's your blank. In 1964, we went off the silver standard and went to Federal Reserve notes. Now, in 1971, the government refused to redeem with gold and silver paper money owned by foreigners. So even though we couldn't redeem it, foreigners could for gold and silver up until 1971. I think it was France that came with a boatload of money and wanted some gold and silver for it, and Nixon slammed the door shut and said, absolutely not. And so Nixon kind of was the final nail in that coffin of our gold and silver standard. So that's our history of money and a little bit about what happened there.
Okay, so some of the critics of the idea that we should go back to sound money say that, oh, you can't do that because since there's a limited quantity of, say, gold, then you're going to limit the amount the economy can grow, and then you're going to limit jobs and prosperity and growth and all that sort of stuff. So how do you address those criticisms?
Well, if you have the money backed by gold, so it is, in essence, it is gold, okay? And you can still increase wealth, because remember Adam Smith said wealth isn't measured by gold. And what's wealth measured by? Labor. By labor and by the necessities of life and quality of life and all those things. So we can still produce things. So what happens if we start producing a whole bunch of loaves of bread, for example, and we flood the market with these loaves of bread? What happens to the value of gold versus those loaves of bread? The loaves of bread become worth less, so the value of gold becomes worth more. The free market will naturally keep it always balanced. So the more you increase the wealth of the nation, it still balances it out, right? Now what the government does need to do periodically is they do need to watch that and try to keep a nice balance between the amount of gold versus the amount of wealth that's in the nation. And they can increase that simply by increasing the amount of gold that we do have. But what's great about gold and silver, well, gold primarily, is that it lasts forever. It doesn't tarnish, and it's fairly difficult to get because there's not a whole lot of it, and so you've got to do a lot of work in order to get it, and because it is scarce. And so that's what keeps it as a pretty stable value. And so, but you see, we can continue to put forth our labor and continue to increase the wealth of the nation. It'll just end up balancing out. And then slowly, as the government is analyzing it, and what the GDP is, then they would slowly increase that amount of gold. But you've got to regulate it and keep track of it very closely, because if you go too much gold, then you can cause some problems. It's still very tricky. The gold standard isn't the perfect system. You're still going to have some hiccups here and there. You will still have big influxes of gold from time to time, like during the gold rush. We had such an increase of gold that in California, when the gold rush first started, you could get a sandwich for 10 cents. By the time the gold rush was at its peak, this is back in the mid-1800s, a sandwich would cost a miner $6, $7, $8. That's as much as it costs today. And so you see, you had this unnatural increase of the money system, and so that did cause some problems. And you will still have that periodically. There's no perfect system, but it always balances itself out and equals itself out. The time when we have more booms and busts is when people, like the private banks, try to control that and don't let the natural market just kind of handle it on its own. Dustin, you got a question?
What gives value to gold and silver in the first place?
Primarily, it's scarcity, and just the things that I mentioned with it being hard to come by. Silver does tarnish, but gold doesn't, and so we know that it's going to last forever. So when we put it in a vault, we know that it's going to stay in that vault forever. So we know that if you were to place the value on something that can deteriorate, for example, wheat, then wheat eventually will end up deteriorating and will go away. So gold has value because it has this longevity.
So could the same be applied to precious stones, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, so on? Have they been used as currency, or
They have.
they retain their value?
Yeah, they have throughout history. Those have been used. One of the real common things that have been used throughout history is actually seashells, because they have a pretty long life. And so those have been used as currency and stuff with some civilizations. But yeah, a lot of different things. But the reason why the founders settled on gold was because when they looked through the history of the world, gold is the one thing that has almost always been considered to have value among the people. And that hasn't always been the case, though. There were some, there's even indication like the ancient Aztecs and Mayans and things had so much gold that, when we find these gold artifacts, a lot of the gold's actually been painted. And so they had so much that they actually wanted to kind of do away with the monotony of all this gold, and they painted these things. So, but it's also easy to work with, and that's the other reason why it's there. So, Debbie in the back.
Can you tell me what you really think happened with the TARP bailout and that whole situation? Was that something that was manipulated by these so-called bankers?
Sure. And the reason why the money is gone or disappeared seemingly out of thin air, a lot of the money from TARP and the bailouts and things can't be accounted for. And one of the main reasons why is because when you have this fractional banking system, you've got to be careful that you don't go too far with it. If you have way too much money out there and not enough asset, then the banks themselves become very unstable. And so usually they try to keep right around 10%, meaning that they'd have 10% in asset and 90% out there in loans. And so they kind of try to keep this balance. Well, when you have all these assets, see what the banks started doing is when they loaned you money, say for instance they only had $10,000 in the bank, they loaned you $100,000, okay? But they anticipated how much do you end up paying back if you borrow $100,000? Over the course of 30 years, you're going to pay back $250,000 or so, right? Okay. And so here you have $250,000. Well, the banks were not only, they were putting that $100,000 on their books, then they were putting the $150,000 in interest on their books, then they were putting the value of your home on their books because they were considering that something they owned. So you see they're counting that money multiple times. And so they were already were putting themselves in a pretty sticky situation with very little asset compared to how much they had out there. And so what they had to do is when the value of those homes started going down, they needed to balance their books back up again. And so all that money got back in there to make it so that they didn't have too low of a percentage in their fractional banking. They had to have some literal asset there. And so all that money was doing was simply replacing the fake fantasy money that they had out there. That's why it's unaccounted for, because it was replacing this fake money. And so all it was there to do is just to try to level out their fractional banking system. So absolutely the banks were involved with that. And that's exactly why George Bush stood there in the press conference and said, I am going to abandon free market principles to save the free market. Right? So if we would have just let those banks fail, then we would have had a much less of a downturn than what we've had. It would be a lot shorter. There was a recession in the early 1920s, and President Harding actually handled it very well, perhaps mistakenly, but he handled it well by not letting the banks do what they've done with this. But in the Great Depression, they did the opposite thing, and we see what happened in the Great Depression. So yes, absolutely they were involved with it. Anything to do with our monetary system, the banks are always involved because the banks own the monetary system. So definitely. Question?
So with the debt that we have, like the debt that we owe China, and what are we paying them back with?
We're paying them back, continuing to pay them back with debt money.
That's not real.
Exactly. And that's why some of the countries in the world are getting a little nervous, because we're starting to get out of balance. Of course, the rest of the countries know this system because they run this system themselves. But when you start getting out of balance and it starts catching up on itself, the whole thing will come crumbling down. And the rest of the nations are very, very concerned that the United States is going to come crumbling down. That's exactly why our credit rating has been reduced, because we're in a very sticky situation. And the main reason why it's being reduced is because it looks like we're staying on the same path. We are not changing our course. And so that's why it's being downgraded.
I know you're not a financial advisor, but informally, would you think it's a good idea for American citizens to buy gold?
You know, personally, I'm a little nervous about that because what'll happen is if we do get things under control, then what's going to happen to the value of money will go back up and the value of the gold is going to come back down. And so right now, gold is inflated because you can usually tell when gold's inflated. Because, for example, back in the early 1900s, you could purchase a vehicle for about $900 worth of gold. And if you took that same value of gold or that same quantity of gold and purchased a vehicle about 4 or 5 years ago with it, it would be about $15,000, $20,000 worth. And so again, you're buying the exact same thing for the same amount of gold. So gold essentially is very stable. You could buy a quality vehicle for the same quantity of gold, early 1900s up till just about 5 years ago. But if you do the calculations today, that car would cost you about $75,000. And so that's what kind of tells you that gold's inflated, is if you look at what you could buy with gold, say 100 years ago, does it match what you can buy with gold today? If it does, then gold's pretty stable. If it doesn't, then we're in a bubble. Now, bubbles are great. You can make a lot of money, but if you don't get out on time, then... So again, you're right, I'm not a financial advisor. But gold is definitely a good investment, and it is a good investment now, but to dump all your money in gold like some people are doing, a big mistake. But that's a big mistake with doing that with anything. Of course, any advisor will tell you to diversify, right? So, but yeah, gold makes me a little nervous right now because it does seem, that $75,000 car seems a little bit scary. Yeah. So, Congress, this is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. Congress, rather than the President, has been empowered to call up the militia of the various states. Militia is your blank there. Anybody know who the militia is?
National Guard.
Okay, National Guard. Anybody else?
Citizens?
Us? Okay. The federal code says that it's every able male, as it states here, between 17 and 44 years. Male is your blank. 17, 44 years old. So it's all the citizens. The militia is not just the National Guard. That's the organized militia, right? But everybody is the militia. And that's the problem with saying that it's only the National Guard is when it comes to the Second Amendment, people will say, you know, the Second Amendment is only the guarantee of the right to bear arms of the militia. So only the National Guard and the military and stuff. And that's just incorrect. The militia is all of us, so all of us have the right to bear arms. And that clause isn't specifically referring to the militia. Anyway, it's talking directly about the people. The Congress can call up the militia for 3 purposes. Number 1, to suppress insurrections. Number 2, to repeal an invasion. And number 3, to execute the laws of the United States. So insurrections, invasions, and laws are your blanks there. Okay? So it's not the President that has this authority. Now, the President's doing this all the time lately, calls up the National Guard and sends them off to do something, and he does not have the authority to do that. Congress has the authority. Okay, let's run to this next section. The federal government was also authorized by the Constitution to occupy certain areas within a state if those areas were purchased by the consent is your blank, of the state legislature. Now, I have a question. Does a state legislature exist before a state exists? No. They do not. Well, this is a problem, because if you see on the next page, this map here, you'll notice the black areas are the percentage of land in each of these states that are owned by the federal government. And so what happened in the western states is when they wanted to become a state, Congress said, all right, you can become a state, but you need to hold off this land for us. And so those states said, okay, we'll do it. But those states had no authority because their state legislature didn't exist at the time. And so the state legislature has to consent. But they also don't have the authority because there's only 4 reasons why they should be able to own land in your state. And they're up here on the top of page 38. The first thing is for the erection of forts. Forts. You know, we need to spread those forts around. Fort Huachuca down in southern Arizona, And, you put them up near borders, and you just got to spread those forts around. So obviously those are going to be within states. For magazines and arsenals. Arsenals, you're blank there. So you want to spread those around as well, because you never know where you're going to need them. But also you don't want to stockpile all your magazines and arsenals in one place, because then your enemy knows how to, like for example, hypothetically, you would never want to take your entire Pacific fleet and put it into one little harbor in Hawaii, right? Because we see what exactly happens with that situation. Okay, so you spread that stuff around. For docks, or for dockyards, number 3, for dockyards, and number 4, for other needful buildings, such as post offices. And that's it. That's all the federal government should have the authority, or has been given the authority, to own lands in your state. And even with that, it has to be by the consent of your legislators, or your state legislature. And so we see that the federal government has totally ignored that. And Theodore Roosevelt was the one that really started this. With all those executive orders, a lot of those were to create these national parks and things like that. And we're not saying that we shouldn't have these beautiful parks, but they should be in the hands of the states, right? In fact, you remember back with Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, Newt Gingrich, remember when they shut government down because they couldn't agree on the budget, right? And they shut government down and they kept only the needful offices, the necessary offices open. First of all, isn't that just funny? Well, if that's all that's necessary, then that's all we should have open all the time. But nevertheless, so they shut down all the national parks. And the Grand Canyon was shut down. Now, I don't know how you close the biggest hole in the world, but they shut down the Grand Canyon. And the Grand Canyon is one of the most visited sites in the world. So can you imagine what that did to Arizona and how that affects our economy? And so we were very concerned about it. So the governor at the time, Fife Symington, no big deal. He said, we'll just send the National Guard up there. They'll open it up. They'll run it. And then when you guys kind of finish with your little fight that you've got going on, then you can come back in. And the federal government slammed that gate shut. Absolutely not. Arizonans are not going to come in and run the Grand Canyon while we're having our little disagreement. I don't know what they were afraid of. Did they think we were going to go up there and fill it in? I mean, the states, those lands in those states, they mean far more to the states than they do the federal government. Because that Grand Canyon has such an impact on Arizonans, we will take care of it, and we'll take much better care of it. When you put national parks up against state parks in terms of cleanliness, being ravaged by wildfires, access for recreation and things like that, state parks win hands down. The states take care of their parks far better than the federal government takes care of national parks. So Congress was prohibited. Also, this is going now into restrictions on delegated powers. Congress is prohibited from assessing a head tax or other direct tax, such as an income tax on the states, unless it was uniformly assessed according to the population of each state. So remember, that's one of the reasons why we had the census, representation and taxation. Now, it's not very often that Congress has to turn directly into the people. At least it shouldn't be very often. They do it constantly now. But originally, most of the federal government was paid for by tariffs. Because, see, the federal government is in charge of relations with foreign countries and commerce with foreign countries, and so they would make their money primarily on tariffs because that was kind of their area that they were in charge of. But there are times when tariffs don't cut it, and that would be times of war, for example, because a lot of times trade is reduced significantly because trafficking from one country to the next is quite dangerous. And so sometimes the founders knew that the government would have to periodically turn inward to the people and tax the people directly. But it had to be based on population, and it had to be equal or uniform. And so the main way that this would be done is by simply assessing the states a tax based on their population. So if we needed $300 million, then they would go to each state. Arizona has, 5-6 million people, and so they would say, Arizona, we need $5.5 million, $1 for each person. And they would go through each state and do that. And so you see how it's equal. And it was up to the states to determine how they collected the tax from the people. So that's what the original, until the 16th Amendment came along. So that kind of goes through and gives us the various powers, these 20 powers that were delegated to Congress. Again, it's not 20,000 I know it feels like it, but it's only 20 powers that were delegated to Congress. And they were very limited powers, and primarily dealing only with the external things of the country and not the internal things. So now we'll pick up, after this lesson, we'll pick up on the next article, Article 2, about the presidency. So thank you for attending.